So good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome again to the Myra Kraft Open Classroom. For those of you who are new, I am David Luberoff, visiting professor here at Northeastern and coordinator of Open Classroom this year. And we're continuing our series of what I think have been terrific discussions around some of the sort of core planning issues and opportunities that the city and the region face as we think about what Boston will look like and be like in 2030. Tonight, we're turning to questions about urban design, and I think it's worth thinking for a minute. Unlike some of the areas that we've talked about in previous sessions, for example, economic development, design is arguably an area where the city has the opportunity, has the power, and has the tools to lay out some ideas and actually implement them either through regulation of private development or through what the public sector does on the land and property that it owns. So on one level, it's easier. That would suggest, in many respects, that design is a question primarily of aesthetics. And aesthetics are absolutely important. But one of the things that those of us who follow cities have noticed and learned over particularly I think the last decade or so, are the ways that design informs and in many cases advances a lot of the goals that we've been discussing in other sessions. So for example, in the early 2000s, when Michael Bloomberg was consciously trying to reposition New York and strengthen its place in the global economic system, he explicitly concentrated on improving the public realm in New York as a way to ensure that mobile global businesses would want to be in New York as opposed to Boston or London or Singapore. Similarly, decisions we make about access to public spaces, such as our waterfront, say a lot about whether or not we are sending a message and are in fact trying to be an inclusive polity. And of course, design plays a central role, or can play a central role, in how well or badly particular neighborhoods and communities function. So design is clearly a major tool in a way in and of itself, but also as a way to advance support and sometimes spur dialogue about really key issues. And that's what we're going to explore tonight. What we've done in assembling this panel is, again, to try and provide a couple of different perspectives on this issue, and hopefully we will have the kind of conversation we want. And here is the missing cable. You don't need my introductory remarks. By the way, this is all a way of saying, reminding you that if you happen to miss a session, or if you come to a particularly terrific session, that all the sessions are videoed and available off of the Open Classroom website. You know, they may not be visually the most interesting, but they're wonderful audio. And in this case, visually, I think will also be quite interesting. Let me stall here for just a minute while we're hooking up these cables with two announcements. One is, as I've mentioned before, some other sessions, the open houses for prospective students will continue through the rest of the Open Classroom sessions. Basically, starting at 5 o'clock, there'll be folks out in the lobby. If you are interested in any of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs graduate programs, or know of folks who might be, it's a real opportunity to sit with a faculty member, usually a student or two, and others who can help answer some questions and explore. So that's the first announcement. The second announcement is we are on break next week. And I know since all of you are active students, you will all be flying to places like Florida and the Bahamas. Do try and behave yourselves when you're down there. You represent Northeastern wherever you go. And the third, as you may recall in our session on housing, those of you who were here a few weeks ago, Barry Bluestone was talking about work that he and Rachel Heller were doing on, as part of a special Senate committee, a Massachusetts State Senate Committee on housing. Barry tells me that today they released that committee's report. I am fairly certain that some of the interesting ideas that we discussed at that session on housing are in the report. So when you pick up your paper or go online tomorrow, hopefully we expect that you will see some things on it and you can again say you were in the know because you were ahead of things. Turning back to tonight. So as I was saying, we're going to have a couple of perspectives tonight. We're going to kick things off with a presentation from Tim Love. Many of you know Tim. He is a professor here in Northeastern School of Architecture, where he teaches housing and urban design, architectural theory. Some of you know him as the former president of the Boston Society of Architects, and many of us also know him as the founding principal of Utile Architecture and Planning. If you go on their webpage, their slogan is, they're a design firm built like a think tank. I'm not quite sure what that means, and I found myself trying to think about what a think tank built like a design firm would look like.
Stanford Business School.
Okay. But Utile is a fascinating firm, and Tim's work has been central to that, because Tim, as I understand it, has been working at these at varying levels, from how does a particular piece of architecture fit into a city? How do you think about the planning process strategically and collaboratively, particularly about complicated urban issues? Tim has been involved with a variety of efforts, including Imagine Boston's efforts to increase public participation in planning. And again, if you think back to some of our earlier sessions, we really focused on one of the central goals, if not perhaps the central goal, is to get more people engaged in the kinds of discussions that we've been having. Tim's worked on a variety of projects, the redesign of City Hall Plaza, planning for the Newmarket District. He was a lead design consultant for the Massachusetts Port, for Massport's exploration of what to do with its development parcels as part of its strategic planning process. And as I mentioned, Utile is a planning and urban design partner with HR&A for Imagine Boston. So Tim will kind of give us about a 15 or 20 minute overview about how he thinks about the role of design and where it's emerging in some of the Imagine Boston discussions. And then we will move to a panel discussion with Tim, with Chris Osgood, my good friend, who was appointed Chief of Streets for the city in August 2015. The first question for Chris will, of course, be, what does the Chief of Streets do? Chris is known to many of us as the co-founder of the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, and he was the co-director of that from 2010 to 2015. And that's a really interesting entity because it was a signature initiative of Tom Menino's last administration, and one of the things that Mayor Walsh identified as something he very much wanted to continue, as opposed to other areas where Mayor Walsh was very clear about things he did not want to continue. So I think that tells you something. Chris had worked as a policy advisor to the mayor. Earlier in his life, he was also chief of staff for the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, so he's well-versed in urban issues. And we'll also be joined by David Carlson, who in 2015 was appointed Deputy Director of the Boston Redevelopment Authority for Urban Design, part of the new leadership team that Mayor Walsh has brought in. David has been at the BRA since 1984, when he started as a student intern. He's been an architect. He supervised the model shop since the late 80s, became a senior architect in the 1990s, and since 1998 has been executive director of the Boston Civic Design Commission, which is the official body that reviews and weighs in on the design questions for particular projects subject to review by the BRA. So in a sense, whatever Tim and the Imagine Boston 2030 process come up with on the private developer side, they're going to wind up talking with David about what that means for a particular project, and it will also, in principle at least, inform the work, I assume, of whatever the Chief of Streets does once we find out what the Chief of Streets does. A question that Chris is still asking himself, I think. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tim for a presentation, and then panel discussion, and then question and answer and discussion with you. Tim.
Thanks for having me. I first need to know, is it this button here? Is there a...
I think we're old tech, so I think...
You're spinning this thing? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
got it. So, as David said, I wanted to share with you some perspectives on how we're thinking about the public realm, the urban realm, very early in the Imagine Boston process. First, because we're at a funny transition in that process from goal setting related to projections about growth, both growth of jobs and the need for housing, and then this funny issue about where to pour that growth, or where to think about where growth can be productive in terms of equity, but also in terms of enriching the public realm. And so we've had to take a half a step back to think about that very carefully conceptually. What we've come to as a working concept is that Boston is comprised of a series of stable residential neighborhoods, mostly stable, both in terms of the social fabric, but also in terms of the physical fabric. If you have a Dorchester neighborhood daydream for a minute, you're standing on a street, you see rows of triple deckers, well-kept front yards, maybe porches on the front, that a design proposal anyway, a vernacular design proposal that's parse and parcel with the social fabric of that neighborhood. And it's hard to imagine in the healthier parts of those neighborhoods a lot of new development coming in. And in fact, the diversity of those neighborhoods might be the reason that Hollywood likes to make, it's not just the tax credits, but each of Boston's neighborhoods has a unique housing type, a unique quality of street, whether it's triple deckers or the row houses of the South End, or the more interesting mix in South Boston where I live. And so we came around the idea that that might be the physical DNA of what we're up to. And so what I'm showing is a sketch of that idea. And by the way, the more than any other North American city, these are separate islands that as a result of topography, fill, infrastructure, the trains, even from the 19th century, more or less are self-sufficient. And even if you imagine if you live in Jamaica Plain or in South Boston or in Charlestown or Savin Hill, it's a little bit like a city-state with some transportation infrastructure and or remnant industry dividing these neighborhoods. Most cities, including Cambridge, where we're also doing the citywide plan, or Brooklyn and Queens, except where the parks and cemeteries are more of a constant weave. It's an archipelago of neighborhoods in Boston that makes it unique. And so since this would be a political advantage, which is we're not going to mess with the cell there, the kind of intact cell, and because each of those neighborhoods tend to have a main street as a result of their history as village centers first, we were really going to focus on growth in the kind of chaos between them. And that chaos, it's not really chaos, it makes a lot of sense. The world as it exists today is an incredibly rational place, actually. This is what you learn as a planner. So There are rail corridors that go through. This includes the rail corridor where the Southwest Park system is running south, where they were going to put the highway. It includes newer incursions like 93 that plays an important part in a lot of neighborhoods where we're looking. And those tended to be the valleys, too, where the more noxious stuff happened, the tanneries, the industry. And those are the darker orange buildings there. That's the kind of post-industrial stuff. Thinking a little bit more carefully about this, structurally, we realized that there is a taxonomy of physical form of Boston neighborhoods that require a different physical design response if growth is going to go in those areas where the neighborhoods aren't, if that makes sense. And so we're imagining the stable neighborhoods almost as a mold between which we pour growth that actually provides the place for 53,000 plus housing units. I think you had a panel discussion about this. X number of jobs. I can't remember HRNA's number. Growth is coming whether we plan for it or not, by the way. The market will seek its way to do what it wants to do. So we want to guide growth in those gaps. And so those include a lot of neighborhoods don't have great main streets because of parking lots, because of failed retail. There's a kind of missing tooth in the middle of these neighborhoods. That's a good place for a certain kind of growth, very contextual. It would be growth that would feather very carefully into the existing housing stock. The fissures between neighborhoods are really like the fissure between Roxbury and JP. It's the kind of a classic one. That's the Orange Line corridor, basically. It's also where, by the way, in the 1950s and 60s, public housing tended to go. Bromley Heath exists in that corridor. There's now a plan afoot to think about redeveloping part of it as a mixed-use community that would include the existing affordable housing plus some market housing feathered in. And then you get the kind of radical edge conditions. That's the way that Charlestown, for example, meets 93, the graphic on the far right. It's also how Savin Hill meets 93. It's also how, until the ink block came, South Boston imagined itself, because the South End was so far away that it just seemed like it died at 93, and then it took a while for the world to get going again. So this has been very useful when we talk to our economist partners, because we both don't understand what each of us do. And it's been a way for us to truly collaborate on the growth data on the one hand and where it goes on the other. So that's inherently already a physical and design conception and not an abstraction. We could talk about that. Maybe this is something, David, we launch into. It's very interesting, the 1965 plan that I know that Matthew Littell showed at an early, qualified the same thing. The 1965 plan didn't dive into the DNA of each of those cells at the level that I did, but qualified it the same way, that you actually have these independent neighborhoods. And that's a little bit the operative narrative of Boston. It's a city of neighborhoods. So there's some narrative value to this emerging concept as well. This is all very fresh, by the way. So what we did is, being 2016, in GIS, we can map very accurately what the 1965 plan was evoking. So these are all of the residential parcels in the city of Boston. As you can see, the fissures. I mean, it's less useful when you get to the downtown core because there's good commercial stuff there too, or Longwood, or the big institutions, the universities. But as you move through Dorchester and Mattapan and south, most of those cracks, and the hatches are the open spaces, but most of that white stuff in there are the kind of fissures that we're talking about. We've then laid in some of the institutional uses, which are the dark blue. And so you can see UMass, MIT, and Harvard are jumped across the river there. Interestingly, Harvard owns land into Beacon Yards that is it growth zone? But and then what we've done in terms of the mapping is laid in heavy commercial and industrial uses, and then we've looked for the big dark patches, because those are the areas in the city where, in terms of making new neighborhoods that feather into the existing neighborhoods, there are the biggest opportunities. And that includes Beacon Rail Yards, which has been a focused effort by MassDOT and now the BRA as a consulting team. I ran a research project with 10 graduate students from Northeastern last year focused on Beacon Yards. The whole Whiteette Circle, New Market area, which is the kind of bullseye in the middle there. And then Massport's lands just east of the convention center, moving up into the BMIP, the Boston Marine Industrial Park. The fringes of Charlestown, and then the waterfront of East Boston making its way all the way to Suffolk Downs. So we were using mapping techniques to pull out data relative to land areas, and then we've developed some draft equations that apply different floor area ratio densities to those areas. We discount how much of the land probably won't turn over so that we can do a rough justice analysis of how much growth capacity there is against the benchmarks. And we haven't completed that analysis yet, but that's our methodology, if that makes sense. Zeroing in on that, back to the fissures, that becomes a way at a parcel by parcel level to really analyze that stuff in between. Now, some of these gaps in stable neighborhoods are bigger and some are smaller. These are probably the biggest and the juiciest and the most interesting because they're the biggest areas closest to transit and or the downtown core that present 100 acres plus of reimagining possibilities. So you all maybe have been tracking a little bit Suffolk Downs, the former racetrack. That was in a competition to be one of the casinos at one point. The landowners, for reasons that make all kinds of sense, were waiting to see if the site across the river was going to happen or not. I helped organize just this week an urban design charrette focused on Suffolk Downs. Actually, if you're available tomorrow night, the charrette team is going to show a plan for that, 6 o'clock at the BSA. Beacon Yards I already talked about. That growth area not only includes the land liberated by moving the Alston tolls closer to BU, but Harvard's also designated a large percentage of their Alston land north of Cambridge Street also for development and not for university uses. So combined, that's quite a large site. And then the area south of Summer Street, north of South Boston, and east of the convention center, the middle slide, is another area that has been put on pause for a while because the policy decision there has been to move the post office from South Station somewhere in that boundary. But that's a lot of land that needs to be considered also for one of these growth areas. So I think as the plan moves forward, we're not going to drill into doing detailed plans for these areas, but a little bit more careful study of these areas relative to the growth goals and what the mix of uses should be in those areas. The other thing that I want to say is that we're very conscious on the team that because there's no more room at Longwood, and because there aren't a lot of large sites downtown, there probably needs to be another job center in Boston that the plan's going to have to contend with. Another place where life science buildings, office buildings, and the larger footprint stuff should go. It means, of course, that should have a healthy mix with housing too, but I think that we're starting to realize that because most of the seaport has been permitted already, that it'll be one of the responsibilities of the plan to think about that. What's interesting to think about when we think about those areas is that back to David's introduction, these areas are going to require both private development, but the wholesale design of the public realm as public infrastructure. New streets, new open spaces, maybe new transit connections. And so this is a case, these sites are interesting in terms of this discussion too, because it's going to require actual public realm design, designed with specificity, but also a package of development guidelines that tell private developers how to meet that public infrastructure. And so they're going to become, in a way, like game theory, a situation where we design the public realm and the parcels in these areas to a point that there's some specificity about widths of streets, sidewalks. We're going to have to make decisions on parcels relative to different developers coming and how much variety we want in those districts. But we're also going to have to design a design guideline book so that when developers do a building, they already know what the rule set is for private development meeting the public realm in ways that put the retail in the right place, the entrances, the service bays and the parking are off secondary streets, not primary streets, the whole toolkit to make the whole system work together as a physical vision. One of the things that is going to drive the logic of these new areas, certainly in the city of Boston, are the pre-existing complete street guidelines. So there's already a rule book for many of the things I talked about embedded in those guidelines. And by the way, our office did these guidelines too. It includes the full recipe about service access, parking access, the relationship of transit stops to buildings, curb cuts, where wider sidewalks make sense when it's a retail street, even drilling into the dimensions that are appropriate for different ambitions for outdoor cafes. So there already is a public realm toolkit that will inform the design of the public realm, which is likely to be done ahead of the private development being done. And maybe as a way to segue to the panel discussion that we're going to have, those same guidelines are also controlling and providing guidance for the improvements of existing city streets. This is a data visualization we did for the Imagine Boston plan that shows the total land budget of Boston, the entire land area. You'll see that streets and sidewalks, which are the dark gray in the upper left, represent a significant portion of the overall land budget of the city, but also open space, public open space. So you'll see that a full, almost 25% of that full land area is actually under public control. And so with the design of these new growth areas will be opportunities to maybe even prioritize public improvements leading from these new areas into the neighborhoods to make those relationships as seamless as possible. It's the same policy that under the Menino administration led to the Crossroads Initiative, which were a series of cross streets to the Greenway that were improved in relationship to the Greenway. So the Greenway wasn't the shiny new thing that was all alone with the existing city streets meeting up to it. And so we see the same logic emerging for how to deal with the growth areas and the way that the complete streets guidelines can kind of feather back into the neighborhoods. Because finally, the advantage of this strategy is that we can break down some of the social barriers between the neighborhoods. If there's a continuous walkable experience without that kind of pedestrian no man's land between parts of Roxbury and Jamaica Plain, or South Boston and the South End, or Charlestown and the waterfront, Boston might become more of a weave and less a series of islands, and that has, I think, cultural and social advantages. And so we have, as part of the Complete Streets project, really a toolkit for the full range of hierarchy of city streets. So that's, I think, the promise of where the public realm meets private property. So I think with this, David, we're going to move to the panel discussion. Is that right? and take it from there.
Can I ask just one question? You started out by talking about stable neighborhoods. Could you define that a little bit more? Because when I look around the neighborhoods, we see tremendous change in the demography of neighborhoods, racially, ethnically, by income. When I first moved here, the Back Bay was pretty poor. What do you mean by stable? Physically stable? Socially?
I think physically stable relative to a focus in this context on the physical stuff of new real estate development. That's what I mean. And I think that the other piece of this, which is very important, is there is a more granular kind of densification that's possible even in stable neighborhoods, but that's a finer grain of discussion that we're having. A downtown version of that is the way that the Millennium projects, to relative success, are dropping in fairly contextually into existing downtown crooked streets and then sprouting much more dense towers above. We're going to get into those policies too. But even, I would say, in existing neighborhoods, are there, through maybe a form-based code in the future, are there slightly denser building types that might allow for a 6-unit project instead of a 3-unit project on vacant lots? Because some of the neighborhoods that we're saying stable still have there's a vacant lot grain that we're going to want to get down to and count for too. Because we can also count that as part of the growth potential budget. But I think it's a very good point.
Thank you, Tim.